Good evening, I'm Judy Woodruff. On the NewsHour tonight, the war in Yemen reaches a devastating milestone. 1 million cases of cholera are reported, making it the worst outbreak in history. Then a big year for the small screen. A look at the most groundbreaking shows and unforgettable TV moments of 2017.
To me, this was the year of, are you kidding me? Like, I just felt like all year long, I was constantly being surprised by what I was seeing. And the great surprise, sort of in the pop cultural realm, was the Oscars this year, where...
The mistake.
The mistake.
And it's Friday. Mark Shields and David Brooks take on the Republicans' tax bill victory and review Congress as it heads home for the holidays. All that and more on tonight's PBS NewsHour.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by
moving our economy for 160 years. BNSF, the engine that connects us.
the Ford Foundation, working with visionaries on the front lines of social change worldwide. And with the ongoing support of these institutions. And friends of the NewsHour. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
President Trump signed the Republicans' $1.5 trillion tax overhaul into law today. He marked his first major legislative victory in the Oval Office and said the numbers will speak to Americans, despite polls showing the bill is seen unfavorably.
I think it's selling itself. It's becoming very popular. But I think you'll see something on February 1st when they open up the paycheck. That's when you're going to start to see it, because by signing it now, it kicks in for this year.
The president also signed a spending bill to keep the government open into January. It includes additional money for missile defense. Afterward, Mr. Trump flew to Florida to spend the holidays with his family at his Mar-a-Lago resort. He will stay there until New Year's Day. Members of Congress headed to their homes for the holidays after passing that government funding bill last night. But the Senate balked at voting on a disaster relief bill worth $81 billion. Lawmakers also put off action on protecting young immigrants from deportation and providing long-term health care funding for poor children. Democrats are pressing Republicans not to wrap up investigations of Russian meddling in the 2016 election. House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi sent a letter today to Speaker Paul Ryan. In it, Pelosi says, quote, "Political haste must not cut short valid investigatory threads." A number of Republicans, however, are saying it's time to finish the probes. It turns out that Russian hackers targeted at least 200 journalists, publishers, and bloggers starting in mid-2014. The Associated Press reports today that they were the third largest group hit after diplomats and Democrats. U.S. intelligence agencies say the hackers acted on behalf of the Russian government. The UN Security Council voted today to impose tough new sanctions on North Korea. They curb the North's oil imports and force its overseas workers to return home, cutting off a source of hard currency. The U.S. drafted the measure, and Ambassador Nikki Haley said its unanimous approval shows the level of international outrage.
Thank you.
Should the North Korean regime conduct another nuclear or ballistic missile test, this resolution commits the Security Council to take even further action. It sends the unambiguous message to Pyongyang that further defiance will invite further punishment and isolation.
The resolution was triggered by North Korea's latest missile launch last month. New fighting erupted today between Israeli police and Palestinian protesters in Gaza and the West Bank. Gaza's health ministry said 2 Palestinians were killed when security forces used live ammunition and tear gas. The Israelis said they responded to violent riots. Protests began after President Trump recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital. In Spain, Catalonia's bid for independence appeared to gain new momentum after separatists won a majority in regional elections. Jonathan Rugman of Independent Television News reports from Barcelona.
It looks like Spanish victory when in fact it's the opposite. One pro-Spain party took 25% of Catalonia's vote last night. But that's not enough to form a government, and so the single biggest political force here was putting a brave face on defeat. Instead, a ragtag bunch of independence parties has confounded the might of the Spanish state. Their vote is slightly down on 2 years ago, but with their leaders jailed or in exile after Spain imposed direct rule, the turmoil of the last few months has barely dented them. And so Carlos Puigdemont, the deposed Catalan president, is likely president again, though he didn't tell his party workers here last night if he would dare return. Mr. Puigdemont was accused of running away to Brussels, but Catalans dreaming of independence have shown they don't care. This morning he said he would meet the Spanish Prime Minister anywhere but Spain, and that he wants his old job back.
Despite all the efforts come from the Spanish state, the violence, repression, despite this, we are stronger than ever.
And Spain's Prime Minister is weaker than ever, weakened by a regional election he himself called. The divisions are huge, he said, ruling out independence once again.
I will make an effort to maintain dialogue with whatever government comes out of these elections in Catalonia, but I will also make an effort to see that the law is followed.
What is staggeringly absent here is any sense of compromise. Spanish unionists are still banking that the sun will set on the dreamers the more turmoil they seem to create. For now, though, the independentistas believe they are on the up. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger, the saying goes, and theirs is a dream refusing to lie down and die.
That report from Jonathan Rugman of Independent Television News. Back in this country, a published report finds an exodus from the Federal Environmental Protection Agency since President Trump took office. The New York Times says more than 700 employees have left, including more than 200 scientists and 9 department directors. The report says that most will not be replaced as Administrator Scott Pruitt scales back the EPA's workforce. Several former Miss Americas are calling for the pageant CEO and others to resign over vulgar, sexist emails. They circulated among CEO Sam Haskell and pageant board members and targeted former winners with sexual slurs and other demeaning comments. The organization's TV partner cut ties with the pageant overnight. The digital currency Bitcoin plunged again today by another 9.5%. Its value had surged this year from about $1,000 to nearly $20,000, but it is down nearly 40% this week. Meanwhile, stocks slipped in quiet trading. The Dow Jones Industrial Average lost 28 points to close at 24,754. The Nasdaq fell 5 points, and the S&P 500 slipped 1. And Hall of Fame sportscaster Dick Enberg has died of an apparent heart attack at his home in San Diego. Enberg's career spanned 60 years, calling Super Bowls, Olympics, Final Fours, baseball, and football, with his signature cry of, "Oh my." The San Diego Padres even stamped it on the field when he retired last year.
Yes, that'd be the obvious what I should say now, but it's already out there on the grass. Oh, the heck with it. I'm going to say it anyway. Oh, my!
He left a mark. Dick Enberg was 82 years old. Still to come on the NewsHour, the U.S. confirms multiple ground operations in conflict-ridden Yemen, a pattern of sexual harassment at Ford auto plants, immigrants seeking political asylum separated from their children, and much more. The war in the Middle Eastern country Yemen grinds on well into its third year. Houthi rebels control much of the country's northwest, including the capital, Sana'a, while a Saudi-backed government and al-Qaeda hold sway elsewhere. William Brangham has the latest on the U.S. role in this conflict.
In December alone, according to the UN, 136 civilians were killed in airstrikes by the U.S.-backed Saudi-led coalition. One airstrike cost this man in northwest Yemen dearly.
They targeted my house while there were 18 to 20 guests. The whole family was inside, as well as all of our cattle. Everything is gone. There's nothing left.
And on Tuesday, the Houthi rebels, whom the Saudis are fighting, fired another ballistic missile from Yemen towards the Saudi capital of Riyadh. The missile was intercepted by the kingdom's air defenses, and the Saudis claim it was manufactured by Iran, which is backing the Houthis. This was the second failed attack on Riyadh by the Houthis in as many months. The Trump administration has also repeatedly called out Iran about its involvement in the conflict, a point driven home dramatically by UN Ambassador Nikki Haley last week.
These are the recovered pieces of a missile fired by Houthi militants from Yemen into Saudi Arabia. The weapons might as well have had "Made in Iran" stickers all over it.
Meanwhile, the Yemeni people continue to suffer. This week, according to the Red Cross, the country registered its 1 millionth case of cholera. Health officials say it's the fastest spreading cholera epidemic in history. And at the same time, millions of Yemenis also live on the brink of famine. A crisis that's been worsened by the Saudi blockade of ports and border crossings, which has limited food and humanitarian supplies. On Wednesday, the Saudi-led coalition announced it would keep the Houthi-controlled port of Hodeidah open for a month to allow aid into the country. The port had been closed for most of November. Yesterday, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Tim Lenderking welcomed the news.
The first thing we want to see is ships actually moving into Hodeidah port, offloading, providing fuel, water supplies for the Yemeni people, filling the hospitals with fuel so that medical supplies can be dispensed. 4 U.S. cranes will be on their way very shortly to Hodeidah. We want to see them installed. We want to see them playing a central role here in offloading ships.
While the U.S. is the largest donor of aid to Yemen, U.S. arms manufacturers, with approval from the U.S. government, also supply the Saudi-led coalition with bombs. And U.S. military jets refuel those coalition bombers and fighter jets. On Thursday, the U.S. Central Command announced that it had also carried out multiple ground operations in more than 120 airstrikes in Yemen this year. Those attacks apparently against al-Qaeda leaders. Last summer, the Trump administration announced the potential for billions of dollars of new arms sales to Saudi Arabia. Arms that will no doubt add to the civilian death toll, which, according to the UN, is over 5,000 and growing. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm William Brangham.
To help explain the complex situation in Yemen, I'm joined now by James Jeffrey. He served in several senior positions during his 35-year career as a diplomat, including U.S. Ambassador to Turkey and to Iraq, and as President George W. Bush's Deputy National Security Advisor. He's now at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. And Stephen Sesh. He was Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs at the State Department, responsible for U.S. relations with the Gulf states and Yemen. He served as U.S. Ambassador to Yemen from 2007 to 2010. He's now at the Arab Gulf States Institute here in Washington. And we welcome both of you to the program. Ambassador Sesh, I'll start with you. Why has this war dragged on and on? What is driving it?
To a large extent, the reason why the war has continued in this fashion is because it sits in a corner of the globe which has not produced the kind of migration into Europe which the war in Syria has. So therefore, the alarm that's being raised about the war in Yemen is far diminished from that we see given the conflict in Syria. So that being away from the kind of the public eye and not creating that sense of threat that's really prolonged and very protracted, has worked to the disadvantage of all the people in Yemen who have suffered on the back pages of our newspapers and not as much coverage on our television.
Ambassador Jeffrey, is this a war between the factions inside Yemen, or is it a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran?
It's both. Only about 5 non-Yemenis, including, unfortunately, Ambassador Sesh, understand what's going on in the mini groups inside of Yemen. But rather like Syria, rather like Lebanon and Iraq, this is part of an overall conflict in the region between Iran on the one hand and Saudi Arabia, the U.S., Israel, and most of the rest of the region on the other.
And what's the main grievance, Ambassador Sesh? I mean, the Saudis are saying Iran is threatening the region. The Iranians are doing what they're trying to do through the Houthis, who are also Shia, the Shia militia there. Who has the upper hand in this argument?
Well, I think it's important to start with the fact that the Houthis, who are a part of Yemen's fabric of society, have serious long-standing grievances with their government and with the Saudis for that matter too. So this is kind of where the Houthis are coming from, and they were trying to, grab their part of Yemen and its power structure. Now the Saudis feel very alarmed, and with reason, by the fact that the Houthis have taken over a lot of the military weapons in Yemen, a lot of the territory, and now control basically an exercise a real threat that Saudi Arabia finds intolerable, and I agree with him, it probably is.
And so it started as something more internal, Ambassador Jeffrey, but it's grown to be this more regional war.
Right, but I mean, you have to point fingers. The main reason it's grown to be that is the Iranian strategy to infiltrate into failed states, and this is a good example of it. Lebanon was in the 1980s. Find groups, typically, but not always Shia groups, that it can support, and then create sub-governments and sub-militias within societies. I saw that very personally in Iraq, that are more loyal to Tehran than they are to their own capitals of Beirut, of Damascus, Baghdad, or Sana'a.
So, Ambassador Sesh, are the Iranians, do they pose the threat that the Saudis and others say they do in the region?
I'm not as persuaded as Ambassador Jeffrey is that the Iranians are the ones that are the engineers behind this. This is a homegrown revolt on the part of the Houthis. The Iranians, no doubt, have gotten more and more involved. The Saudis have gotten more and more involved. So now I think each of these two rivals are seeing Yemen as an arena in which their interests can be served. But I also think that a lot of what we see now, a lot of the humanitarian issue that's emerged, is a direct result of 3 years of protracted Saudi airstrikes. I saw data today from the Yemen Data Project. 15,000 airstrikes have been conducted over Yemen, a country smaller than the state of Texas, over a 3-year period.
Why has this grown to be the humanitarian crisis that it is, Ambassador Jeffrey? I mean, it's one thing for the two sides to be fighting each other, but the civilians are the ones who've taken the hit for the most part.
In almost every conflict I've seen in the Middle East, the conflicts are actually fought out not in the desert, but in the populated areas, and all sides use unrestricted airstrikes to make up for typically a lack of infantry troops. The Saudis in these airstrikes have killed, according to the UN report in October, some 3,000 civilians. That's a big number, but it's not all that different than what we've killed in the conflict against ISIS in Iraq and Syria over the past 3 years.
But the U.S. is not and the U.S. is part of this coalition with the Saudis that has helped lead to these civilian casualties.
Right, and the reason for that, though, is the Saudis and the U.S. fear. The two sides aren't equal, Iran and Saudi Arabia. Yemen borders on Saudi Arabia. It doesn't border on Iran. It's a long way from Iran. More importantly, the Saudis have seen this movie before in Lebanon. The Shia group there, Hezbollah, had their own legitimate grievances against Israel and against their own governments, but they became a front for Iran. They have over 100,000 missiles right now aimed at Israel. It's an existential threat. The Saudis fear, for good reason, the same thing in Yemen.
But you're saying that fear is overblown.
I think the fear is genuine. I do think that it is not quite the fact that Iran has come in here to try to become the arch enemy, they already are, of Saudi Arabia. But the Houthis need to be dealt with as a nationalist movement on their own. The Iranians are taking advantage of this. They're exploiting a situation which has been created to their benefit. Very low investment, very high reward for the Iranians here. So I think what the Saudis need to do is figure out what they can do to extract themselves, because they're getting dug deeper and deeper in the muck of this war, and they have a lot of other items on their agenda that need their attention and their resources.
Do you believe the Saudis will see a way to extract themselves?
They haven't demonstrated that interest as yet, nor have the Houthis for that matter. So I think both sides need to realize at this point that the only way they're going to have any of their interests served is by sitting down and negotiating a way out of this. There is no military victory. The Saudis cannot win this war, certainly not the way they've been fighting it for 3 years. And the Houthis don't need to win it. They just need not to lose it.
You agree the Saudis can't win this?
Absolutely. Steve has the right way forward. The only problem is the Saudis can't do this if they're going to face a future with hundreds of thousands, or at least tens of thousands, of long-range missiles in the hands of the Houthis, and thus with Iran aiming at the capital, Riyadh.
Well, where do you see this going then?
I see the United States finally coming up, which we haven't yet, with a real policy of trying to deal with Iran in the region, and that's the whole region, not just in Yemen or Syria, and then telling the Saudis, look, we have a program, we understand that any solution has to exclude keeping a lot of Iranian missiles, i.e. a repeat of what we have in southern Lebanon today. But as a quid pro quo for that, you've got to deal with the Houthis, just as Ambassador Sesh said.
But that would involve, Ambassador Sesh, the U.S. Coming down harder on Iran.
On Iran and also on Saudi Arabia. And I think we've seen recently that the White House and the State Department have begun a real strenuous campaign of putting some pressure on Riyadh, which has paid off. The Saudis just announced they were going to reopen the port, or allow the port in Hodeidah to be reopened, and they're going to let the cranes come in there. So I think this demonstrates that if the U.S. does get aggressive, does apply the pressure, the Saudis will respond. And at the same time, Iran needs to be brought into this in some way because they are playing a role in this, and I think we can't ignore that. We need to find a way to constructively engage all of the parties who have an interest in this and bring them to the table together.
Ambassador Stephen Sesh, Ambassador James Jeffrey. It's good to have you both. Very tough subject. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy.
Now, a disturbing investigation about a culture of harassment at a pair of Ford auto factories. Ford's CEO made a public apology yesterday for the alleged misconduct. The story raises questions about what's happening to some blue-collar workers. Hari Srinivasan explores why it's proving difficult to change the underlying culture.
Ford already had dealt with a federal investigation, lawsuits, settlements, and changes at 2 Chicago factories to deal with racial and sexual harassment going back decades. This week, the New York Times chronicled how abusive patterns with female workers had returned to these plants. The reporting team spoke with dozens of women about what they had faced recently and in the past, including Suzette Wright. She first worked at one of the plants in 1993 and eventually quit.
Every time I would have a new instance of something sexual happen, because I had already seen the ramifications of saying anything, I would stand there and take it. And each time that I was taking it again and again, it just felt like more of me diminishing, just getting smaller.
Susan Chiro is one of the 2 reporters who worked on this investigation for the Times. She joins me now. You work with Catherine Einhorn on this, your partner from Chicago and in New York. What was the culture that the 2 of you documented?
When we talked to many, many workers, they told us that men would grope them, make lewd sexual remarks about their bodies, and if they complained, they would face ostracism, threats, and a lot of hostility both from their coworkers who were worried that the plants might close and from their bosses.
All right, we have an example of that kind of fear. Shirley Thomas Moore had this to say.
It's hard when every day you come in and if you say something and something is done, it gets worse. So that's why a lot of women do not complain. They don't say anything. There was one particular situation where this young lady, she finally got enough guts to go up there and report it. But before she can get down to the line, it was already known what she went upstairs for. So who's telling it? She was taken off that job and put on a harder job.
In response to your reporting, the executives at Ford put out this statement, or part of a larger statement. I'm sorry for any instance where a colleague was subjected to harassment or discriminatory conduct, and there's absolutely no room for harassment at Ford Motor Company. We don't want you here, and we will move you out for engaging in any behavior like this. Our promise is there will be no retaliation against anyone who speaks up, and no one is above the rules, no matter where they are in the hierarchy. Were these instances that you documented with these women, are they anomalies, are they episodic, or is it systematic?
I think that depends on who you talk to. Ford thinks of them as episodic. Some of the workers would argue they're systematic. We certainly know that there was a huge ongoing pattern of abuses. There was a kind of lull in the early 2000s after the first set of lawsuits and after independent monitors moved in. And then as economic pressures mounted, the auto industry was at bankruptcy and then recovered, and a whole new surge of hiring came in. It certainly roared back. Some workers argued it never left.
This is not a small startup company. This is Ford, has a huge infrastructure, has a human resources department. The employees have a union. Why was this culture tolerated for so long?
I think there are many answers. The union turns out to be, in the eyes of many workers, part of the problem instead of the solution. The union has a hard task. They represent the men who are accused as well as the women who accuse the men. But at the same time, women said many, not all, union officials sometimes harassed them or discouraged them from complaining.
As you mentioned, this is not Ford's first instance of this. Considering that they've had this problem before, what happens now?
Well, I think there are two things. I think the other point is that Ford could have moved much more aggressively and much more consistently. But now they have this new settlement, and monitors are going to move in again and oversee compliance, and Ford has been putting measures in place. So I think the great test is going to be, can a culture of sexual harassment really be controlled for a permanent time?
What's been the response of the women that were on, in print, with their photos, with audio that clearly the boss read about? What have they said about you and your reporting now?
I think that they welcome attention because they feel that attention will help them get solutions. Some of them wanted us to go further and name a lot more people, and we obviously had to apply our journalistic standards to what we felt comfortable including. But I think that they welcomed the apology, but they want to see action.
And these are not women that normally get the type of attention that the entire Me Too movement has shed a light on.
That's right. One of the women said to us that as she saw Harvey Weinstein and the whole Me Too movement, she wanted to start a Twitter campaign called #WhatAboutUs. So I think these women do feel that their plight has been ignored, hasn't been part of the conversation. Was absolutely our motivation to try to understand as reporters what women in blue-collar or service industries away from the limelight were enduring.
Is there a feeling of why they felt empowered to speak now?
Well, I think the women involved have been speaking out in the last several years. Not just this minute. The complaints have been going on for several years. I do think that this is a moment where I think some women are hoping that change will be more permanent.
All right, Susan Cherry of the New York Times, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
The New York Times and the Washington Post have reported that the U.S. Department of Homeland Security is considering new rules to deter those entering the United States illegally, separating children from their parents. Under current rules, families are kept together unless immigration officials determine parents do not have sufficient documentation for their children. From PBS station KPBS in San Diego, Jean Guerrero reports on one family already undergoing the traumatic experience of separation.
I feel powerless not being with them.
No poder abrazarlos.
Not being able to hug them, kiss them, play with them.
At least 4 Central American men in this Otay Mesa detention facility say officials took their children from them after they arrived at the border asking for asylum. In a statement, ICE said, for the safety of the children involved, ICE must require documentation of these family relationships. The agency says that's because smugglers often pair children with non-parents. The agency says the men didn't have enough documentary proof that they were the fathers, and that officials are trying to verify familial relationships through the consulates. But Jose de Marfuentes says he gave customs officials at the port of entry his son's original birth certificate and his Salvadoran ID. KPBS has seen copies of those documents.
I wasn't going to come to a strange country that isn't mine to present myself with a child without documents.
Immigration officials sent his 1-year-old son Mateo to an Office of Refugee Resettlement facility in Texas, more than 1,500 miles away. Fuentes traveled from El Salvador to the U.S. with his partner, Olivia Cáceres, and their 2 sons, Mateo and André, in a caravan of asylum seekers. They were on the road for more than a month, traveling on Mexico's infamous train, La Bestia. The family says they were fleeing gang violence and extortion at home.
Ay, qué rica tu naricita.
We visited Fuentes' partner, Olivia, at a migrant shelter in Mexico, where she's staying with André until she learns more about what's happening with Mateo.
This is the first document they give us in the hospital, so I kept it. He had the original birth certificate of the boy.
She says the family split up in northern Mexico because they were in a rush to get Mateo to the border. The boy was weak and dehydrated after weeks of traveling. The couple didn't have enough money for the 4 of them to get to the border right away.
The priority was always Mateo, his health. Andre is older. He says, "Mommy, Mommy, don't go, Mommy." Mateo is fine with his dad.
The couple didn't think U.S. immigration authorities would separate a father and a 1-year-old child. They thought the duo would either be detained together or released on parole. Leah Chavarria is an immigration attorney. She says families seeking asylum are less likely to be released on parole under the Trump administration.
Now what I see is a leaning toward detain, and if there's not a place to detain a father and a child, then they're going to detain them separately.
Chavarria says family detention centers are currently focusing on women and children. She says the separation adds to the traumas of violence they're fleeing in Central America. In the migrant shelter in Mexico, André plays with other children whose parents also brought them from Central America. They sing songs they learned on the journey.
Why do they kill us? Why do they take our lives?
Cáceres says she's been repeatedly calling the facility in Texas where officials sent her youngest son, Mateo, but that all she's received is a single call back letting her know that the boy is fine. The Office of Refugee Resettlement has declined to comment on the boy's case, citing privacy concerns. Immigration officials have the discretion to let the father out on parole at any time. But under the Trump administration, the policy has been to detain for at least 6 months. Cáceres says the boy has a right to be with his father, that Fuentes is the best caretaker.
Everyone knew him in the caravan because once when Mateo was very sick with a bad fever, all night Jose was holding him and pacing with him.
Cáceres says she's heard that U.S. officials take good care of children and that she's trying to focus on that, to stay positive for André. Back in the detention center, Fuentes says Cáceres tries to keep him calm over the phone.
She gives me strength. How am I? Do I eat? Do I sleep? To relax? That's everything is going to be fine. That Mateo is in good hands. That she's taking care of André.
Fuentes graduated from the Catholic University of El Salvador with a degree in journalism.
I like to know stories. I like to write.
But before he could pursue his dream of becoming a journalist, he and his wife began to fear for their lives. The couple says gangs were extorting them for money they didn't have, and Fuentes' close friend was killed. Fuentes says he wanted to be a good father because he never knew his own. He was raised by his mother, who died a few days before he graduated.
She told me she was proud of me. It's sad to have the family fragmented. One person in one place, my mother in the sky. My son I don't know where. Olivia with André.
He says he's placing all his faith in the institutions of the U.S. and hopes he'll be reunited with his family on American soil. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Jean Guerrero in San Diego.
And the analysis of Shields and Brooks, that is syndicated columnist Mark Shields and New York Times columnist David Brooks. Gentlemen, welcome. 3 days before Christmas, Congress has just gone home. David, the president says this tax bill that they passed is a great gift for the American people. He said today corporations are going wild over this. They're showering their employees with bonuses. But the polls show people are still skeptical. What are people to make of this?
Yeah, well, I have not been a big fan of this tax bill for a whole number of reasons, one of which I think was revealed today. When you look at all the intricacies of it, not all the big things, little changes that could have vast effects on American society. For example, we got the health insurance system, the employer-based health insurance system, because of some minor change during World War II. This has all sorts of minor things because we had no hearings, because we had no expert review and no time to actually look at what's in the bill. It has dozens of that kind of minor change that could have massive effects. For example, we could all, it doesn't make sense to work for a company anymore when you can declare yourself a corporation and pay the corporate rate. And so that could just have massive effects without the economy. So it's actually kind of hard to know what the effects of this tax bill will be, because I think most of them are unintended.
So are people scratching their heads, Mark, or are they worried? What do you see?
People have concluded, at least a strong initial judgment, Judy, that it is a bill that favors corporations and favors the very well off. That is a conclusion. As Peter Hart, the pollster, says, when a negative judgment is formed, it is very difficult to overcome that. And that is the perception. Most people don't have the option of declaring themselves corporations. That comes to a level of affluence and influence not available to most American families. And I think what David cited is a good example.
Yeah, I would say one thing. I don't think it's going to be a political loser for the Republicans, because 80% of the country of tax units does get a break out of this, of varying sizes. Some people get a pretty significant breaks. If you've got a kid or a couple kids, the child deductible tax credit, that it doubles and it becomes refundable, so you actually get a check in the mail. And a lot of people are going to be seeing that, and a lot of people are going to be surprised to see that. So I don't think it'll be the total loser that it looks now. I think now the polling, people don't know what's in the tax bill. They just don't like Trump. He's associated with it. They get the Republicans favor the rich. But this bill is, you spend $1.5 trillion, you can give a lot of money away.
So so Mark, you're
Disagree? Disagree? Could I disagree?
Yeah, go ahead.
1986. Which was an exemplary tax reform bill. Ronald Reagan passed the Senate 74-23, passed the House 296-132, bipartisan, overwhelmingly, and popular. As President Reagan refused to sign anything that was not deficit neutral. Judy, historic. And that year, 1986, the Republicans lost control of the Senate, lost 9 Senate seats. Democrats increased their majority in the House. In 1981, after President Reagan signed his then historic first tax cut, the same thing. The Republicans suffered. David's point is that they get a couple more bucks. I get $20 more or $30 more in my check, but I'm going to be regaled and inundated with stories of millionaires walking away, of special interests, of Wall Street getting it, and it becomes a very relative. I'm starting to feel duped because all of these wealthy people are getting windfalls.
Yeah, and I think the Republicans are going to do very badly in the midterm, but not because of the tax bill.
Okay.
And there are a lot of in '86 it was revenue neutral. In '81 there was a recession. Now times are economically good. So you can vote on a lot of things. In general, when you run up big deficits and give away back money to people, they like it. And people like me say, hey, you should worry about the deficits or you should worry about the distribution effects. That's just never been, I think, my experience of how people responded. They say, hey, I got some money back.
Well, you brought up the midterm elections, and that's what I want to ask you about. But David, your point is that this tax bill is not going to affect Republicans in the midterms that much. Whatever.
I mean, who knows? I mean, the midterms are still a year away. I think the reason people don't like the Republican Party is not because of the tax cut. It's because they don't like Donald Trump. They don't think they're functional for a zillion other reasons. And I think it's opinions about Donald Trump are dictating polling about everything else.
But Mark, the Democrats go into this election at a disadvantage when it comes to the numbers. There are more Democrats who are up for re-election, a number of them in states that Donald Trump won. I mean, in the Senate. And they're behind in the House. So how do you see this right now?
I think both history and the polls are very much in the favor of the Democrats. and the wind is at their back. The Republicans just passed this historic tax bill without a single hearing, without a single Democrat. It was totally unpartisan, and it showed where the Republicans, what they care about. I mean, they're leaving town gleefully, self-congratulatorily, with 8.9 million American children in a state of anxiety and suspension about whether they'll have medical coverage. And the children of immigrants, DACA recipients in this country, 900 of whom are in the United States military today, and don't know whether they will be allowed. They've had a green card fast track to citizenship from military service in the past. They don't know under this administration whether they'll be allowed to remain in the country, let alone serving the United States in the military. But they show the priorities, Judy. The priorities was the tax cut. And I just think going into the election, they're just in terrible, terrible shape. And the Democrats history should be against them in the Senate. But right now, Republicans are apprehensive even about retaining Senate control.
Well, yeah, there's multiple targets here. That's not why I think they're in terrible shape. I think they're in terrible shape. We've talked about this before. There's the thing called the generic ballot. Which party do you want to control? Which party and usually if one party is +9, they're like due for a tidal wave of support. And the Democrats right now are +13 or 14. That's just massive. Now we're a year away, and the Democrats have the problem their voters are all clustered more than the Republican voters. But still, it looks like a tidal wave election. If it was today, it'd be a tidal wave election. And it looks like the kind of elections where Democrats would not only carry swing states, like, maybe even Arizona, something like that, but states where you don't even imagine. You remember, like, Scott Brown won in Massachusetts in a way you don't imagine. But
like Alabama?
Yeah, right, well, okay. So that weird things happen in years like that, and if it were held today, that's what would happen.
So could I just agree with David? I agree with David. And the liability the Republicans have is that their problems are not curable or susceptible to cure with an initiative or a new policy, because the face of the Republican Party is Donald Trump. And to quote our friend Peter Hart again, who's done focus groups for Emory University, of Trump voters, the words that Trump voters use to describe Donald Trump are childlike, troubled, immature, narcissist, embarrassing.
And these are people who voted for
These are
him.
people who voted for Donald Trump. And the point I make, Judy, is he's very pleased with himself. He's pleased with his temperament and his personality. I think we got that at the celebration, at the signing of the passage of the tax bill at the White House. But I think there's no way this is going to change. And if he's the face of the Republican Party, that's an enormous albatross.
Yeah, people don't judge little legislation in the way that policy economists do, but people are really good at judging character. And maybe not last November, but in general. And so they've taken a look, and especially suburban voters and women have taken a look at this guy for supporting Roy Moore, who, by the way, has behaved gracelessly in the last week. And they've made up their mind. And Trump has kept his core rural base, his white rural base. There's just not a lot of those people.
So you're saying it's not fixable for Republicans?
Well, I always hesitate because I've been surprised in the past, but I don't see how the people who I think are disappointed Trump voters and who are non-Trump voters seem very set in their opinions. They've made a character judgment about this guy and a character judgment about the way he's running the country.
And the intensity and the passion is on the side of the Democrats. And by every measurement, David measured the polls, they are more interested and care more. And, if in real estate, the three elements that matter are location, location, location. In midterm elections, it's turnout, turnout, turnout. And right now, turnout will favor the Democrats.
And if you look, especially if you look at Alabama and at Virginia.
Yep.
Yes.
Oh, exactly.
So we are just a couple of days from Christmas. I have to ask both of you, in this season of giving, is there somebody you can think of out there in the political or the larger world who you would like to give a gift to whom and what? David?
Well, I've had a series of conversations, interviews with people who work in government, some career people and some Trump employees. And what strikes me is, among all of them is they're really sad. They're very sad. And they need happiness. So I was thinking, what makes everybody happy? I think it's dancing penguins and Louis Armstrong. That's why I want to have penguins dancing to Louis Armstrong songs for all those people.
But just to be clear, you're talking about people who work for the federal government as civil servants.
And Trump employees. Everybody is very unhappy right now on both sides and unhappy with each other. There's just a wave of depression.
But there's a serious point under there that they're having a tough time.
Well, the
as we
career
go.
people find it very hard to serve an administration they don't believe in. The Trump people find it very hard to serve an administration without camaraderie, and that's not the way all past administrations have been. It's just it's tough for them, and they came here. A lot of them are good people who wanted to serve the government. They sort of believed in the agenda, and they find the career staff is quite hostile to them, and they find the people they are appointed with are not always friendly because the culture of any administration is set from the top.
Mark, a gift?
Yeah, I just add to David, that is, it's tough to work as a public employee in a government, for a government, or led by an administration that doesn't believe in you and what you do. My own present or offering would be to Doug Jones, who won that Alabama Senate seat. In his victory statement, Judy, he showed us. He thanked people individually, and he was so gracious and so generous. He never demonized anybody. He never skewered his opponent. And he said, this is about bringing people together. And I think it was a wonderful example. And I just want to say thank you, Doug, and bring that same spirit to Washington, because Lord knows we need it.
Uplifting note on which to end this conversation, as I wish both of you a wonderful holiday and Merry Christmas.
Thank you so much.
Mark Shields, David Brooks, thank you. And before we go tonight, a helpful guide for those of us who may do a little binge watching during this holiday season. It is part of our year-end look at some of the most interesting work in different fields of the arts. Tonight, Jeffrey Brown showcases the best of TV and video.
Trying to pin down the best TV of the year is becoming ever more difficult in this age of streaming and unlimited channels. But for a flavor of the year, we turn to a pair of critics who somehow try to keep up with it all. Eric Deggans of NPR and Jen Chaney of New York Magazine. She writes for its pop culture site, Vulture, and welcome to both of you. Eric, you start. One on your list was The Deuce from HBO. Tell us about that one.
So this is an interesting series. It was done by David Simon, the creator of The Wire, and it's a detailed look at how the porn industry grew from becoming this sort of illegal venture in the 1970s around Times Square to becoming a more legitimate business that was actually controlled by the mob. And James Franco gets a lot of attention for playing twins, based on actual people who are at the center of this. But I was really entranced by Maggie Gyllenhaal, who does an amazing job playing a streetwalker, a prostitute, who decides to change her fortunes by becoming a director in porn films, just as pornography is being transformed from something that's sold illegally under the counter in brown paper bags in certain bookstores to something that you can see in peep shows and something you can see in movie theaters and actually buy openly in bookstores.
Okay, let's take a look. We got a short clip here.
So what are you offering? Next time I get my ass kicked, I can cry on your shoulder. What's the cut you take for that?
Ain't gonna be no next time you come with me. Hey, man. I'm gonna have your back everywhere you go, baby.
All right, Jet, you also had an HBO show, which was also on Eric's list, Big Little Lies, a big hit of the last year. Tell us why. What did you like about it?
Well, I loved the series. It was my favorite of the whole year. And what I really liked about it was you had these amazing female actresses, Reese Witherspoon, Nicole Kidman, Shailene Woodley, Laura Dern, in this story that really put women front and center. It was about the politics between moms in Monterey, and it was sly and funny, but as you kept watching each episode, it got deeper and deeper into these characters.
And darker in some ways.
And darker. I mean, there was a whole storyline about Nicole Kidman's character and a domestic violence situation that I thought was just a really insightful and powerful look at that type of situation.
Okay, we have a short clip from that one. Let's take a look.
You're wearing the dress I bought you. I know. My new dress, my new shoes, my new friend, Jane Chapman. Hi. Celeste. She came to my rescue when I was trying to save young lives. It's a whole story. I'm going to kill Abigail. That's her son, Ziggy, right there, who's playing with Chloe and the boys.
Can you believe that they're in first grade?
I know. Take a lot of pictures.
Hi, Maddie.
Nathan, hi. Bonnie. And this is Jane. This is Bonnie, Nathan. Sky. Oh, I love this.
Oh, thank you. I made it in Peru.
Of course you did.
All right, Eric, how about one or two others briefly, just that struck you this year?
Well, my top pick was actually another show that talks a lot about women pushing against a patriarchy, The Handmaid's Tale on Hulu. An amazing translation of a classic novel that talks about a dystopian society where a theocracy has taken control of the United States and has subjugated women, and in particular has forced some women to become breeders for the leaders of that country. Elizabeth Moss is amazing in it. Samira Wiley is amazing in it. And again, given the themes of the moment, given what we're talking about right now with sexual harassment and assault, it's an amazing story about how women are pushing back against a patriarchy that takes over America.
Jen, you got another one?
The Good Place, which is an NBC comedy, and I think it is great because it's both light, but it's also really intellectually rigorous in that it deals with philosophy. It's about a woman who ends up in what she thinks is heaven, but has not been a very nice person on earth, but is trying to kind of keep maintaining the fact that she should be there. And there's a big twist at the end of the first season that I won't reveal for people who haven't seen it, but it changes your entire understanding of what the good place is. And in the second season, it continues to just surprise over and over again.
You pervert!
You know, one thing, Eric, that did get a lot of attention this year is on late night and elsewhere is the coverage of politics, right? Bringing politics into television. You told us before we started about the Jimmy Kimmel moment on healthcare. Tell us a little about why that struck you.
Jimmy Kimmel was always viewed as someone who I thought sort of kept politics at an arm's length in his comedy. But when events got to the point where he was touched personally, he had a son who had a health scare, or not a health scare, health problems and multiple surgeries after he was born, and it brought him in contact with the healthcare system. He realized that some of the things that were happening in politics just weren't quite right, and he called it out in the show with detail, with humor. He was somebody who knew what he was talking about. He wasn't someone who was known for being a political firebrand, but when he decided to make his voice known, he was very effective.
If your baby is going to die, and it doesn't have to, it shouldn't matter how much money you make. I think that's something that, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or something else, we all agree on that, right? I mean, we do.
Is there a moment for you where the country was kind of hit by stuff like that?
To me, this was the year of, are you kidding me? Like, I just felt like all year long in politics and other ways, on television, social media, I was constantly being surprised by what I was seeing. And the great surprise, sort of in the pop cultural realm, was the Oscars this year, where...
The Mistake.
The Mistake, where we saw La La Land win, and then all of a sudden, wait, no, they didn't.
I'm sorry, no. There's a mistake. Moonlight, you guys won Best Picture.
Moonlight won. This is not a joke. This is not a joke. I'm afraid they read the wrong thing.
This is not a joke. Moonlight has won Best Picture. Moonlight, Best Picture.
And even that had a political kind of subtext to it, because it was Moonlight, this film about an African-American gay man coming to terms with that and really living his life the way that he should be. And a lot of people were rooting for that. And so when La La Land seemingly won, it was like, oh, and then it was meaningful that Moonlight did.
One more subject, Eric. We've talked about this, you know, year to year as things change, and this was the evolution of television. This was the growth and power of Netflix, though, does continue, right? Is that the? Tell us what you're seeing happening.
Well, Netflix really stepped up this year. I mean, they had a major release of a TV series almost every weekend throughout the year. Something like 36 new shows debuted over the year. They spent $6 billion on original programming. They're projected to spend more next year. And you get the sense that in the media world, some of these mergers that we're seeing, AT&T buying Time Warner, Disney thinking about buying parts of 20th Century Fox, you wonder if part of their strategy is trying to compete with Netflix, which seems to be trying to offer everyone everything, from stand-up comedy to documentaries to movies to TV series to old TV series that you can watch as reruns. And can the rest of the media world compete with Netflix, or will Netflix get to the point where it becomes the Google of television?
All right, Jen Chaney and Eric Deggans, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I've been writing down shows I want to watch. And on the NewsHour online right now, what makes a movie into a great Christmas movie? We have 5 non-traditional film recommendations for the holiday season. That's on our website, pbs.org/newshour. And we will be back right here on Monday with the best of the U.S. military's musicians singing and playing Carol of the Bells. That's the NewsHour for tonight. I'm Judy Woodruff. Have a great weekend and a very Merry Christmas.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by BNSF Railway.
Supporting social entrepreneurs and their solutions to the world's most pressing problems. SkollFoundation.org.
The William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, for more than 50 years, advancing ideas and supporting institutions to promote a better world at hewlett.org. And with the ongoing support of these institutions. And friends of the NewsHour. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
You're watching PBS.